Whenever I talk about you to any of the other people involved, they're, oh yeah, Jack Schmitt.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
so
the astronaut, you know, that's the familiar name. Yeah.
Good. We one of the reasons we want to talk to you actually is because it occurred to all of us putting this together that you hold an unusual enough distinction from the Apollo period that there's almost an under-publicized nature to it, we kind of felt, thinking about the whole thing. Because when you look at the 12 people that went, actually walked on the moon, 11 of them were, I guess you would say, astronauts by trade, people who had been NASA...
Well, I'll argue with you about that.
I mean, I guess you are too. You know?
In the days of Apollo, anyone who flew in space had to become a full-fledged pilot, full-fledged member of a spacecraft team. So
yeah.
I don't see how you can make the distinction. Now, the distinction is that the other 11 men who walked on the moon were military-trained pilots. They had received their pilot training through military service. I had received my pilot training as a civilian with the Air Force, but as a civilian after I was selected as an astronaut. And I guess the real distinction is I was the only professional scientist, namely geologist, that had landed on the moon in the Apollo series.
Well, we think that sort of made your particular role that much more exciting.
I thought so.
It did, yeah. It was a distinct role. I mean, and it was as a scientist, as a geologist, and perhaps not as a pilot by trade, but although you had certainly become an accomplished pilot in your own right.
I had to. They weren't going to let me go unless I did, so that became the first big hurdle I had to go over.
In that capacity, when you think back on the whole mission, were you able, and I don't know, some of these guys when we talk to them are nuts and bolts when they talk about Apollo, and you say, was it exciting, was it the trip of a lifetime, etc., what was it like when you were hurtling toward the moon, and they'll say, well, I was working on CO2 exhaust systems and I really didn't think about it. Did you at all get the opportunity to sit back, think, and reflect any more than anybody else, or not necessarily?
Well, I think everybody had a chance to reflect a little bit. But clearly, as Dick Gordon put it once, time is relentless once you're launched from the Cape. And you're guided pretty much by the mission plan and the timeline to make sure that you get the maximum value from every minute. And you try to absorb as much as you can, so not only are you enjoying yourself in the process, but then you can reflect when you have more leisure time. There certainly was leisure time, in a sense, on the way to the moon and the way back from the moon.
Right. A
total of about 6 days, in which part of the time, at least, you could think about what in the world am I getting into when I get there, and then after, what in the world have I done after I've been there. So there was that opportunity, but clearly in the 22 hours we were outside the spacecraft, in this magnificent valley of Taurus Littrow where Gene Cernan and I landed, you're going all the time trying to make sure that you maximize the value of each minute.
Pretty much constant work once you hit that point.
It is constant physical and mental work for 7.5 to 8 hours while you're outside the spacecraft, and then there's a half hour to an hour on either side where you're preparing to go out in your pressure suit, spacesuit, and the like. So it's an intense, hard day's work. Now, fortunately, it is not physically tiring except for forearms. You do get your forearms extremely tired and fatigued. And mentally, you're working just as hard as you would anywhere else. But in 1/6 gravity, it is so easy to move around and so much fun that you can see everybody's having a great time. And if you listen to the videotapes and the audio tapes, you'll hear people singing and telling jokes and puns like I did, unfortunately for my crewmates. And just having a great time. It's so much easier than training that you can't help but have a good time.
And part of that is just the physical release of that light gravity.
It's the physical and psychological release. The physical release of the 1/6 gravity relative to Earth's gravity, but also the psychological release that, you know, after all of these years of training, I'm actually here and I'm getting to do what I wanted to do, either as a pilot astronaut or as a scientist astronaut, or some combination of both, as I was. You're finally in a position to do that, and you're doing it in such magnificent surroundings. You just can't imagine what it's like to be in a valley deeper than the Grand Canyon with a brilliant sun, as bright as any New Mexico sun that you can imagine, illuminating all of these slopes, and everything placed against a black sky, a sky that literally is blacker than black as we're used to it.
Yeah, it's an odd black and white look in a sense when you see pictures of it,
It
because
really is.
the flag almost jumps out at you
It
because
does.
of the color.
It does, but really the pictures do not give you a black sky, because you cannot print on a piece of paper black.
Yeah.
But that's what you're looking at. And then, of course, seemingly hanging above the southwestern mountains of the Valley of Taurus Littrow was this beautiful blue and white marbled earth that we have grown to love through the eons. And it really makes for a spectacular opportunity. We had a great time. And I think we did some very valuable work.
Oh, yeah. Let's chronologically look real quickly here at your mission, which is from the time that you got in, not counting the endless, really, years of training that led up to it. The time the rocket, the Saturn V, lifts off, you and I've years ago happened to talk to you one time about it, and you said that was one thundering, wild moment that you really clearly never forget, where you're subject to that level of G-force and everything else. What was that like when it was taken off?
Well, every day has its excitement, but clearly once we were actually going, the extraordinarily heavy vibration with a gradual buildup in acceleration forces was something that one never forgets. It's something that's never simulated. You hear people talk about it, but it's like so many of life's meaningful experiences, maybe all of them, that you can't anticipate it until it actually begins to happen. And for us, there was the added release in that we had gotten within 30 seconds of launch, and the launch computer had stopped it. So we went through the countdown once before, wondering if it was going to ignite.
How long was your delay?
About 2 hours and 40 minutes.
So sitting in the capsule and just...
That's right. And then at about 2 minutes and 45 seconds after launch, the main engine shut down. You drop that first stage off, and then the second stage engines ignite. And that is an interesting experience in itself, because you go from 4 Gs, 4 times ordinary gravity, where you're 4 times your weight,
right,
to a minus 1.5 Gs as this whole big rocket unloads. When the engine shut off, you actually decelerate, and then you go to a plus 1.5 Gs on the second stage. That all takes place in just slightly over a second. That gets your attention.
Your stomach could be jumping around on that.
Everything's jumping around on that.
So at that point then, you hit a 200 plus, whatever it is, mile orbit around the Earth.
No, actually it was about 90 nautical miles. That's one of the interesting things that people don't realize. We built these rockets using the English system of measure, inches and pounds and feet and yards. We flew them using the nautical system of navigation, nautical miles and so forth. And we worked on the moon using the metric system of measure, which is the normal scientific system.
Right.
So if astronauts sound confused when they're talking about units of measure, they probably are.
They're
At least we've
everything.
forgotten. That's right.
At this, let's see, a couple of revolutions, I don't know what it was.
About
around
3
the Earth.
hours. It takes 90 minutes per revolution around the Earth. The main reason for that was to make sure that the third stage rocket, the S-4B, was fully ready to take us to the moon, and that our spacecraft were fully ready to be taken to the moon. And after the ground has a chance to look at all those things in 3 hours, then we ignited the third stage rocket again over Australia at night, at Earth night, and began to burn about 5 minutes, as I recall, through a sunrise, the most spectacular sunrise you can imagine. And we were accelerating from 18,000 miles an hour, which is the normal orbital velocity, to 25,000 miles an hour, which is what was required to get us within the sphere of influence of the moon. That sunrise, though, is another one of those experiences that you don't forget.
And at that point, you're beginning to pull away from the Earth.
Yeah, we're going away from the Earth. We can just, from then on, we can coast. We don't need any major rocket burns at all, and we'll hit the moon, or we'll come close. We're leading the moon. The whole trajectory was planned, so the moon was coming like this, and we were going to go around the front side of it.
Any particularly profound thoughts as you were leaving the Earth's gravitational pull there?
No, except that once we had the Lunar Module Challenger in tow, we had to turn around and extract it from the end of the third stage rocket, and so that we could all go to the moon together and have something to land with. That would be nice.
Yeah.
And but once we had that, then we could start looking back at the Earth, and that was just at the moment where we were able to look back on a nearly full Earth with that spectacular view of Africa that you've seen now in the pictures that we took. Just an unbelievable sight. And we had those kind of views then for 3.5 days as we went to the moon. And being an amateur meteorologist, I spent a great deal of that time trying to forecast what the weather would be like when the Earth rotated after 24 hours and we saw the same part of the Earth again.
Right, right.
And that was a great joy for me. It turns out that I think I filled about 3 inches worth of transcript with my descriptions of the Earth as we went towards the moon.
So I didn't realize you pretty much during that 3-day period have that singular view then. It's dropping away, but...
it's getting apparently smaller. It's just getting farther away.
Yeah.
But it still with a small 10-power monocular that we had on board, telescope if you will, we were able to keep a pretty close eye on the weather patterns as we went.
So at the same time you're closing in on the moon, are you actually able to see that out the other direction or no?
In our case it wasn't, because we were so far, our landing point was so far to the east on the moon, and we wanted to land at a low sun angle, that is, most of the moon was going to be dark, that's what we saw. The only thing that we could see, and occasionally Gene Cernan reported he could just see the limb of the moon as we approached it, but for the most part we could not see the moon. It was just this dark black hole in space, if you will, that was blocking out the star field, and then as we went into orbit around the moon, it blocked out the Earth itself. And one of my favorite pictures, although it's not much in terms of a picture, is when you see the outline of the mountains of the moon across the Earth, and that's what we call the loss of signal point, where we no longer could communicate with the Earth.
No more line of sight.
No, and every 45 minutes out of each 2-hour orbit around the moon, we were out of communications with the Earth. And that's pretty nice too, as long as everything's going well.
What's the star heavens look like at that point?
If you turn off all the lights in the spacecraft and adapt to the darkness, then you see a magnificent display of stars, not unlike what you would see in very high mountain country on a clear night with no moon, but still a much blacker sky again that you can imagine.
Yeah.
And then also, just before sunrise, you have the opportunity to see these magnificent streamers that are part of the solar, the corona that are coming off the sun. And that is just also a spectacular sight.
And now somewhere along this in your mind is, damn, I'm at the moon. I mean, you know, somehow it has to seep in, right?
It does. Every time you see something like a lunar sunrise, the first one from the spacecraft, and craters and features on the moon that you're familiar with, at least I was familiar with because I'd been studying the moon for a good part of my professional career.
Yeah.
And so the moon was a relatively familiar place to me, particularly on the near side of the moon. We hadn't concentrated very much on the far side. Once I couldn't persuade the NASA managers that we should land on the far side.
Right.
That was one of my little
projects.
Thought
that might be an idea.
Oh, I thought it'd be a great idea.
Now there's another moment that's significant here when the two systems break apart and you, and in this case Gene Cernan, head down to the planet itself. You're on your way, and that's obviously a lot of work involved and everything else, right?
Well, that's about a 10-minute flight, and since we were landing far to the east on the moon, we only had a short amount of time to get all the updates that we needed in order to land exactly where we wanted to land in the Valley of Taurus-Littrow. So once that was done and the engine was started, there's not much else you can do except monitor the computer program, make sure that it's doing all the things at the moment it's supposed to do them, and eventually everything worked out fine. We pitched over at 8,000 feet, and that's the first time we could look out the windows and actually see where the computer was taking us, and everything looked perfect. Gene, of course, was now looking out the window, getting ready to take over manually if he had to, while I was giving him the information that he needed from the computer in terms of how fast were we moving, how fast were we going down, how far was the landing site, and so
Is it a relatively light touchdown, or what? Is there a little bit of impact to that?
Gene took over at about 500 feet, like most of the crews did, to make sure that we maneuvered out of the way of any craters or rocks. And then nulled, as we say, zeroed all the velocities, lateral velocities, until we were just going down. We touched down at something like, as I remember, 2 or 3 feet per second, which isn't very much. So it's a pretty soft touchdown.
So yeah, very.
But you're touching down in dust because the effluence from the descent engine is blowing dust away from you all the time. So you're having to look through that dust for touchdown.
So
but you can actually see through it. But it's a streamer.
But you see it blowing away.
Oh yeah, well you see it going out in streamers.
Yeah.
Remember, there's no air on the moon, so it's not the same as you would expect to see here, billowing around you because of the interaction with air. It's taken off. It's going to the horizon.
Yeah, nothing's stopping it.
No.
Then you're in the capsule for another little while before you finally set foot, right? Was this a couple hours? Or?
There was originally a plan. Said, well, why don't you guys get a night's sleep before you go out the first time? I said, forget that, you're there.
Yeah.
And you really haven't had a very long day up to that point. And so once it was clear that all the spacecraft systems were okay, and we were go for stay is one of the expressions that they use. Doesn't make much sense, but that's what they use. Then we began to prepare for our first excursion. And so within a few hours, we were out on the lunar surface.
Your adrenaline's going full tilt.
It is throughout the whole mission, really. I mean, that's, if anything, probably fatigues you and has made you really tired when you get home. It's this continuous pulse of adrenaline that's going all the time. Not because of fear or apprehension, but just because you want to be absolutely sure you're taking full advantage of every moment.
Sure, and just general thrill, too. Yeah.
And the first time I really had a feeling, though, that I was finally unequivocally on the moon, for sure, was when I moved away from the lunar module. After I'd gotten out, everything I saw at that point was familiar to me. I mean, I was looking right into the lunar module. I'd worked with it for years. I knew as much about it probably as anybody. And then when my task took me some 75 or 100 yards away from the lunar module, then it just became a colorful part of this total magnificent scene that I mentioned earlier.
And if you looked away from it, of course, you're looking out at just raw moonscape, and you feel like you're way away, I would imagine.
Well, you don't. I never felt like I was a long way away from Earth. I mean, rationally, I could look up, and there's the Earth 250,000 miles away. But the communications were so good, and we were so well prepared to experience what we had there that I never felt like I was really a long way from home. Now, that may just show I hadn't broken the code yet, but still, it was familiar terrain. And
the work itself was enthusiastically done over the next day or two, whatever you spent with the rover and everything else.
It was. The rover was a big help. We lost some time the first day on deploying the science experiments because of a problem with the gravimeter that was we were trying to fix, and later found out we couldn't have fixed because it had been built into the gravimeter. But nevertheless, we were active continuously. And you go through, though, like any time, you go through highs and lows as the emotions.
You actually sleep while you're there.
Oh, between excursions, yes.
So you're on the moon asleep.
Oh yeah, we were in hammocks, sleeping. Took about 5 hours to recover from each day's activities, and we actually planned 8 hours, but nobody slept that much.
Yeah, I wouldn't think. It seemed to me it'd be hard to go to sleep, but I don't know. Maybe you're so exhausted. I mean, that there's.
Oh no, I didn't have any problem going to sleep.
Mission itself went well.
Some of the earlier crews did, but that was largely because they were trying to sleep in their suits. And the spacesuit is not comfortable when it's not inflated. It's very uncomfortable.
So you're out of it in the hammock.
We got out of the suits. It was like having 2 more people in the spacecraft. But we were able to manage it. Of course, a lot of planning. We did a lot of exercises to make sure we knew how to stow everything.
Yeah.
And then we put the hammocks up and got a good night's sleep.
That mission, as far as you're concerned, scientifically or geologically, went very well. You got what you needed to get. I mean, did you feel disappointed in any way, or did you feel like, I gave it the full 100%?
Well, the only disappointment was I didn't get to stay another day or two. It really would have been fun to do that. Have one day where nothing was structured. Even though we had lots of flexibility, we changed plans and things like that. Still, it would have been nice. All right, this 4th day, we're just going to go outside.
R&R.
And we're going to wander around, go to places that were interesting to us. We would have liked to spend more time at Station 4, and looked at the orange soil some more, things like that. Just have some unstructured time. The lunar module could have done that had we planned it that way, but NASA didn't want to spend that extra day.
Yeah.
And so the time was really, I think, well used, but still it was disappointing because I had to leave. The original plan for Apollo 17 was to do 2 things scientifically, primarily, besides the deployment of the experiments and things like that. One is to see if we could verify the model of the history of the moon that had developed as a result of the first 5 missions. And then, of course, to see how much we could augment that model, because we were going to geologically the most complex place that anybody went in the Apollo series for 2 reasons. One is it was the last mission, and so let's take on as tough set of problems as we can.
Sure.
And the other is that, well, we've got Jack Schmitt, geologist, on board, and maybe we can do that.
Yeah, yeah.
And the advantage of having any professional in space or anywhere else is that people who have put in years of their life in a particular field will sort through what's important and what isn't important much faster than somebody who has not done that.
Sure.
It's no knock on that on other people. The other astronauts were just super observers, and they did an outstanding job of collecting samples and telling us where they came from in the context. But nobody expected them to act like a professional geologist.
You could scientifically
any more they expected me to act like a professional test pilot.
Sure, exactly. You could scientifically. Is there, in any sense of the word, sadness when you're in the lunar lander, ready to hit the button to go back up, leave?
No, not at that point. And the reason is that it's time to go. And you want to be absolutely sure that you're doing everything right. You're focused on the portion of the mission at hand. For me, the sadness came is after we had rendezvoused with Ron Evans in the Command Module America. And the Challenger had been closed out. We'd gotten all the samples out and all the film and everything, and configured so that once we had undocked, the ground could crash it into the moon.
Because they leave that there.
Well, to get it out of orbit, so it wouldn't be debris, and also, though, to give one more controlled signal to the seismometers that had been deployed on the surface of the moon. It was energy. We put some, everybody, all the missions put seismometers on the moon. And that was that moment of leaving the lunar module that became very sad for me, because there's no friend, for crying out loud. I had spent a good part of my life taking care of that particular piece of machinery, and when tears came, they came at that moment.
There goes my pal, the lunar lander.
That's when it's really all over.
Yeah, and then at that point, you orbit the moon another time or two.
Actually, we spent over 2 days more in orbit around the moon, because remember now, Ron was operating in the command module a series of remote sensing instruments, cameras and spectrometers and other types of instruments that were looking at the surface of the moon and mapping, in a sense, the chemistry and the features of the moon. Plus, for me, it was a great opportunity to be a remote geologist, if you will, using the monocular and my own eye, which the human eye is still better than for many things than other instruments, trying to understand some of the puzzles on the lunar surface from 60 miles away. So I had a great time. It was
productive time too.
I think so.
Yeah.
And even as we left the moon, I was able to map what I call color provinces, and as we went away, because you can see the color, the different shades of color when you're up close to the moon that you can't see from here. So it was a good science time for me as well.
Was there any discussion at all about being the last ones, because you did know that these follow-up missions were not going to occur, that this was likely going to be it for a while?
I don't recall any major discussions. There were obviously a comment here and there, and then when the president's statement was read up to us, that was part of Nixon's statement, which I thought was inappropriate, frankly, that he made the statement that we were the last humans to visit the moon in this century. Well, even if it was true, it was unnecessary to say. It turned out it's probably true, but it still was an unnecessary statement for all those young people who were also paying attention and still had some thoughts that they would like to go into space and to the moon themselves. But I think we'd already discussed that pretty thoroughly, because we knew from August of 1971, I think, that Apollo 18 had been canceled and Apollo 17 would be the last mission.
And the date of your return was what?
Was 19 December, I believe, 1972.
So the very end of 72, year 72. Along with some of the other guys, they've had the same feeling, but when you were coming back, perhaps you had a little bit of reflective time, as we're saying. Did you get that same sense of the Earth as fragile environment, floating around in a black space, and isn't this a precious place to be?
I don't think I've expressed it that way or felt exactly the same way.
Because you've heard
something
I've
to
heard that effect, yeah.
And there's no question that the Earth has some aspects to it that with 10 billion people on this planet in the next century, we may well be able to do it some serious damage. But we also have to remember, see, I'm a geologist, and I've been thinking about the Earth my whole professional career, and I thought of it as a whole, and that I intellectually had already placed it where it was in space and around the sun.
Sure.
And I think some of those thoughts had not really yet occurred to some of the others in the astronaut corps until they actually saw it.
Yeah.
And so I had a somewhat different initial perspective to the Earth. And of course, I view the Earth as not as a closed system. Its primary source of energy is the sun, and so all the energy we get and use, one way or the other, directly or indirectly, comes from the sun. And so it's not closed. In that sense, it's not like our spacecraft. Our spacecraft was a closed system.
Sure.
Everything we had on board was what was going to make it possible for us to survive. Here on Earth, the sun is what is giving us the potential to survive. So that's our source of energy.
Yeah.
And also, I knew the Earth is an extraordinarily resilient place. I mean, it has suffered tremendous catastrophes over
Probably
time.
worse than anything we can do, arguably.
But we weren't here when most of those catastrophes occurred.
Fortunately.
So and now we do have to be concerned. And that was one of the exciting things that came later, actually 15 years later, when a group at the University of Wisconsin realized that we, in the samples from the moon, had been analyzed a light isotope of helium called helium-3 that is potentially a very important fuel for fusion power.
Fusion power,
Earth.
for sure, right.
And it's environmentally benign. It turns out if you fuse helium-3 with itself, you get no radioactive byproducts. And so that, if you start to think of the moon and the Earth now as a single environmental system rather than separate environmental systems, you can begin to see how the moon has the potential, at least, to help us not only find an alternative to fossil fuels for the future, but to satisfy the aspirations of those 10 billion people who are going to appear here in the next century.
Do that, that's right. Going back, did you have that same view of a slowly enlarged Earth, and as it got day to day, were you looking at it that way?
Not quite as much, because of course we were now looking at a crescent Earth. We had launched with a full Earth. 2 weeks later, all we could see was a crescent. And the Earth was changing its phase as we were fooling around on the moon.
Yeah.
And so as we came back, we didn't have those spectacular views, and it was a little less interesting from that. Being in space is always interesting.
Are you looking at the moon recede?
Yes. We actually, for the first day or so, looking back at the moon was more interesting than looking forward at the Earth.
Trepidation on coming back into the atmosphere, and this is going to be hot and hit the ocean and etc.
Not really. Once the trepidation is how good is your burn out of lunar orbit, the so-called trans-Earth insertion burn, TEI burn. That is critical, because that's going to determine how closely you're going to hit this window in the atmosphere. It's actually pretty easy to hit, but we had about a plus or minus half a degree of angle to hit the atmosphere. And once that burn was done and it was clear we wouldn't even need a mid-course correction. We had a few, but they were just to have something to do more than anything else. We were golden. We were fine.
Is there a sense of hitting the atmosphere? Do you recognize that?
No, you don't hit it. But in about 30 seconds, you get a very rapid buildup of G-forces. And you go from weightlessness to 7 Gs, just like that. Almost just like that.
This is another stomach-turning event here.
Yeah, that's the highest. Actually, entry is more violent than launch. Because as you enter the atmosphere, you want to be absolutely sure that you're captured, that there's no chance of the spacecraft skipping off the atmosphere, and that'll ruin your whole day.
Yeah, that'd be
ruin
bad.
Your whole week. And with so you fly this thing at 35,000 miles an hour. This spacecraft actually flies like a wing, has a lift vector, but you turn it upside down in terms of its flying capability. So you dig into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And so you dig in, but before you can roll it and recover and the computer can roll it and recover, you pull 7 times gravity. And it's just for a peak. It's just for an instant. But you tense your muscles and you're able to
at the same time here. Are you seeing a red hot blast?
That's just beginning. It begins about the same time, and then you roll out, and the spacecraft holds 4 Gs as it literally flies to where the computer believes the carrier is, out there in the South Pacific. And so you're slowing down, you're flying towards it, and you're rolling like this, back and forth as the computer actually flies itself
with
to
the
carrier.
Atmospheric heat.
And with these bright, we call them flames, but they're not really flames, because what's happening is there's this ablative shield. It's actually it's ceramic. It's like pottery that's covering the front blunt end of the spacecraft. And as it heats up, it melts, and it's incandescent. It gets very hot, and it's very brightly colored, and it is what is melting off and streaming back by the windows. So it's not really flame, it's this ceramic material that's melting and keeping the spacecraft cool. That's how you stay cool in the spacecraft, is because all the heat is being carried away by this molten ceramic material. And
before you know it, I guess you got parachutes and...
Well, at 25,000 feet, the drogue chutes come out. These are just like in special fuel racing. To stop, they throw out a drogue chute. Well, we threw out 3 of these drogue chutes, and that's when it really gets violent. You're shaking around on those drogue chutes very hard as it slows down, and then at 10,000 feet above the ocean, they're severed and let go, and the big parachutes gradually deploy. It seems like they're never going to come out. But
you're never really worried, huh? I mean, scientifically or in engineering terms, you're thinking, we're going to make this.
I think it's like anything that you prepare yourself to do and train to do, and whether it's final exams in college or launch or entry. If you've really done the job right, if you've trained well and you've done everything that is reasonable to think of that you could do to be prepared, you don't worry about it. You go ahead and do it. And obviously anything worthwhile has some risks associated with it. But still, those risks have been minimized, and you know it, and if you were worried about the risk, you wouldn't have gone.
Did it feel pretty good jumping out of that capsule after all that time?
Well, actually, we didn't get to jump out of the capsule for a while. It took about an hour for, as I recall, for the the SEALs, the Navy SEALs, to get the collars deployed and the raft deployed and the hatch opened. And that's not a very good boat. That command module, that ice cream cone shaped command module, does roll around on the swell of the South Pacific or any Pacific pretty well. And if we were ever really physically uncomfortable, I think it was at that time. Nobody got sick, but we were uncomfortable at sea. But once the hatch is open, and those guys are great, the SEALs are just super. They had that thing open in short order, and we were getting some fresh air in, and then they helped us out into the raft, and the helicopter that had obviously had met us from the Ticonderoga, the carrier that some of your viewers may remember. It was hovering over and put down a basket, what they call, I think, a survival basket, and each one by one we got into that basket and were hoisted up to the helicopter. And from there we flew over to the carrier. The carrier actually was parked about 5 miles away from the planned splashdown point. After the early Apollos had been so precise in where they were landing, the Navy decided they better move the carrier away, or we'd get a carrier landing, and that was not what was expected.
As you look back on all that entire mission, as opposed to the details, which are very well put here through the course of the thing, what is your encapsulated thought sort of about the whole thing? I mean, is it scientific? Is it geologic? Is it in some broader human terms? I mean, what do you think of?
Well, it's all of the above. First of all, Apollo accomplished the mission that was set for it by John Kennedy, and that namely put human beings on the Earth, bring them safely back home. And it was in response to a political challenge that we, and I think all of the Western world, felt from communist Soviet Union. And it was important at the time, and indeed probably even helped to lead to the final breakup of the Soviet Union, because it convinced, I think, the Soviets and the Russians that if we decided really to go forward with the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars, that it would be successful. I mean, they were not successful in going to the moon. We were, and so it built a great deal of confidence in them that we could probably do whatever we decided we wanted to do. And maybe they had more confidence than we did in it. But nevertheless, I think Apollo did contribute what it should have to that political environment of the time. So it's sometimes hard to remember those times now when everything has changed so much, but still it was important at the time. In more human terms, we also demonstrated with Apollo that we could go live in the solar system, that the human species could establish enclaves of self-sufficiency on the moon and on Mars, and that if we decide that we want to spread our species throughout the solar system and ultimately probably into the universe, that is now open to us. Not fully open, but still technologically, there are no significant barriers between us and that kind of a larger realm for the human species.
I asked the same question, and I asked it to you too, of some of the other people who were involved in various capacities of all the Apollo programs. At the time, it probably did not occur to you, because it didn't to anyone else, that the single biggest hurdle in, whether it be the species movement or whatever it might be, would end up being money. Because at that time, although maybe with your mission, when you knew the other ones were canceled, that had reared its head at that point. Prior to that, money wasn't really the linchpin here in all this. It was just there.
No, but it was a reason. The way the program was financed was the reason that we were successful. And it's one reason, in contrast, why many programs seem to have overruns, to not be successful. When it was decided to take on Apollo, the country was willing to put the resources necessary not only to do the job, but to solve the unknown problems that were going to develop along the way. And if when that money's available, you can get the job done. There's just no question about it. We didn't follow that with the space shuttle. We did not follow that, have not followed that with the space station. We did not follow that with the superconducting super collider.
Right.
It's just not the way of the world right now to put adequate resources on the particular goals that we set for ourselves, and then we're disappointed because we don't make those goals. Now, with Apollo, we didn't do that. We did it right with Apollo, and we set the goal right, and we financed it right. And we haven't done it right since.
No, and you're in an interesting position to address that, too. 6 years in the Senate, and you have some idea how difficult the financing hurdles are to all that. Does it leave you in any way discouraged? I mean, the shuttle is an ongoing enterprise, and I mean, it's done its job well, but is the broad reach, whether it be Mars or whatever else, you know, sort of these high-aimed, sort of ethereal goals, are they ever going to be sought again, or is the money thing just going to kill it forever?
Well, I think the catalyst for our next movement into deep space, and particularly back to the moon, is going to be the private sector. I don't think government, with the increasing focus on social challenges and the financing of those challenges by the government, however you may feel about that.
Any government,
that is the
almost,
focus.
Yeah.
That they're just not going to be the discretionary resources available from the taxpayer to finance these kinds of adventures again. And so I think it's going to happen through the private sector, and it's going to be, and the catalyst there, I think, will be the energy resources on the moon that will get us back to the moon to stay, and permanently, with settlements on the moon, so that we can have these alternatives to fossil fuels here on Earth.
Yeah.
And then once that starts, then that can finance and indeed provide resources through byproducts that are produced on the moon for the next movement towards Mars. So I think we really have to now start to get used to that government is not going to be the major player. It's going to be a partner of sort, because it has to make the legal environment compatible with what needs to be done,
right,
and what people want to do. But I don't think government's going to be the major source of financing any longer for these kinds of endeavors.
And looking even at that scenario, it sounds fairly long term. I mean, in order to have that kind of activity on the moon, if you're thinking about that before there's an effort at Mars or something like that, this is not tomorrow.
It's not tomorrow, but it can be within the next 10 years, very easily. We know how to go to the moon. We could take a Saturn V technology, create a Saturn VI using the concepts of the Saturn V with modernized technology and computers and materials and so forth. Have a much better rocket with a much higher payload, maybe 2.5 times the payload. And with that, you could begin that movement back to the moon. And for a fraction of the cost. Remember, the capital cost in today's dollars of Apollo was about $65 billion. Everybody can do their own numbers, but if you look at the records, it was about that, and translated in today's dollars. But that included all of those extra monies to solve the problems we didn't know we were going to have to solve. Now we know how to do it. And so you can look at that as being a fraction of that cost. If you put that in terms of how much did it cost to put a kilogram of payload on a trajectory to the moon, comes out about $70,000 per kilogram. That's a lot of money. However, reducing that by, say, a factor of 30 or something like that is not at all out of the realm of possibility. And when you get it down to those numbers, a few $1,000s per kilogram, then all of these things that you've asked about and that I feel are important to the future of humankind really start to become possible. But it's going to be the private sector that makes it happen, I think. It's not going to be the governments. I'm there. That's good. It could be used today.
It does not exist here.
Well, there's some. You get some from the weapons program. There's a little bit in natural gas, but not near.
there's enough for research and development, but not enough to run an economy.
Yeah.
And the moon is fortunately a collector for us up there. And its value relative to coal today is about 3. If you really look at it objectively, it probably can't be commercialized. It's going to be too expensive.
Yeah.
And you're going to produce a lot of radioactive byproducts as a result of the neutrons.
Even though we think of fusion as being a clean...
It's cleaner than fission.
Yeah.
Cleaner than fission, no question about it. But still, you're going to end up with comparable kinds of problems. Not as big, but still comparable problems. Business that eventually gets you to power plants.
I think what Joe Engel said yesterday was that he had some faith in the notion of business somehow arriving at the ability to do this just as much in a consortium of countries, Japan, France, Britain, the United States, some Russia maybe, I don't know, trying some other effort at...
International consortia are going to be very difficult to work, to manage. They are much easier to work because everybody sort of speaks the same business language.
Right, exactly.
But they don't speak the same political language.
No.
And as we've seen in most international